the Republican presidential nominee. When I hear that, I hear social conservative. I'm told that Republicans, to win, must be anti-abortion, anti-gay marriage, for the war on drugs, for stricter immigration controls. Gary Johnson's for none of that. And he isn't even, and neither is the audience. Candidate Johnson isn't even religious. He doesn't go to church. That's unheard of in many conservative circles. Republican strategist Karen Hanratty says that's not going to fly in a Republican primary.
No, it's not going to fly in a Republican primary. I think a lot of it actually isn't going to fly with a lot of mainstream voters, in fact.
What about that? You're going to say, I don't go to church, I don't believe in God?
Well, I don't say that. I believe in God. I don't go to church, but I certainly don't lead with these kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that they're going to bring it up.
I think
they will bring it up.
Well, and that's fair game.
Sure.
It's absolutely fair game. I think I'm not in the minority here when it comes to believing in God and not attending church.
But the reality is, when you go to Iowa and you go to a caucus, there is a very religiously conservative constituency in these early primary voting states.
Absolutely.
That I think are far more religiously conservative than many people even realize. I mean, you know, have you had people lay hands on you and pray, Gary? Because that's a big part of the Republican caucus. That's a big part of the Republican primary, and going to the Voters' Values Summit.
I think, Karen, the Republican candidates go to a caucus and people lay hands on them and pray?
You know, it's I mean, it's not uncommon, right? This is a very personal connection with them. You know, they often want to hear from Republican candidates. What's your testimony? What's your walk with Christ? What are the values you and I share in common? And I think that's a really important part of connecting with these voters. And I think it's something that you would struggle with.
So you're toast.
Well, no. First of all, I respect the views of a social conservative. I think that 60% of Americans describe themselves as fiscally conservative and socially liberal. Now, I would argue that perhaps it's not socially liberal, that it's really classically liberal, which is the notion that less government is better government. The notion that the best thing that the government can do for me is to let me be the individual that I might be. And as governor of New Mexico, I did that. Maybe there'll end up being 120 candidates running on the Republican side of the ticket. But right now, I think I'm the only candidate that would support a woman's right to choose. And I might add, I support a woman's right to choose up until viability of the fetus. And
when's that?
Well, the court has actually described that as being able to sustain the fetus outside of the womb, even if by artificial means. That is actually the law of the land currently.
So about 20 weeks or so.
I think you'd have a very difficult time getting past a lot of Republican primary voters on that issue, but that's not the only issue.
But before we leave it, you said you're in the majority, but that you don't go to church. Don't the majority of Americans go to church or temple or something?
I don't. I think the majority of Americans consider themselves religious, but I don't know if the majority of Americans actually attend church.
But I would say a majority of Republicans in South Carolina, for instance, which is an important primary state, go to church. In fact, if you drive through South Carolina, you'll see something that I certainly did not see living 20 years in California, which is street signs indicating, you know, it's 5 miles to the next church. I mean, these are street signs in South Carolina.
Well, so
it's part of their culture. In an early Republican primary election, you're going to have a difficult time connecting, and that's a big part of getting elected, is connecting with people and having a shared sense of values.
Sure. And I might be wrong, but I happen to think that given that there are 11 or 12 candidates running on the Republican side of the ticket, that I'm going to offer up a choice that doesn't exist anywhere else.
Well, I definitely agree with that. I guarantee you, you're offering the only choice to legalize prostitution, and I guarantee you there's not another candidate, even on the Democratic side, who's going to want to legalize prostitution.
Well, and I've never actually led with the notion of legalizing prostitution. What I've been asked many times is is would you legalize prostitution? And my answer to that is that, first of all, I don't have any desire to engage the services of a prostitute, and I never have.
Stipulate.
And I never have, but we already have one state that has done this. And if you were to engage in prostitution, where is it that you would want to engage prostitution? You'd want to do that in Nevada, where it was safe, where it was safe and where it was legal. Likewise,
Drugs, you would decriminalize at least marijuana.
Well, I would. I would legalize marijuana, and I say legalize as opposed to decriminalize because I think decriminalize turns its back on half the problem, which is the marketplace. When it comes to all the other drugs, in a nutshell, we should look at the drug problem first as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue.
But that's not how voters look at it. Voters are not, I would say voters across the board. In fact, if you look at the polls, you don't really have support for legalizing marijuana, even in the Democratic,
Actually,
voters.
we're just 2 years away from being at a tipping point on that issue.
But you look at it as a health issue. I think you come at it from a very theoretical, scientific point of view, but I think it's politically tone deaf.
Well, let me tell you my experience with marijuana, that it's not theoretical. I've smoked marijuana, I've drank alcohol, and although I don't do either today, the big difference between marijuana and alcohol is that marijuana is a lot safer. And for the 100 million Americans who smoke marijuana, I think there's a recognition of that. So,
do you recognize how difficult it is that you're taking a position that a majority of Republican primary voters absolutely disagree with?
Karen, thank you very much. Gary, stay with us. Next, we'll go to war. Two wars, actually. We're going to talk about the war against terror and the war against drugs when we come back. Welcome back. We're devoting all of tonight's show to another presidential candidate, Gary Johnson, former governor of New Mexico. My last guest took him on skeptically from the right. My next guest, historian Thaddeus Russell, attacks him from the left. So, take it away.
I heard a remarkable thing on Fox News the other night. A politician actually mentioned a study done about the Portugal drug decriminalization policy. For 10 years, all drugs in Portugal have been decriminalized since 2001. And they found that across the board, all the harmful effects of drugs have decreased since that policy was enacted. And
that politician was?
That politician was Gary Johnson.
On Sean Hannity's show.
It was on Sean Hannity's show. But then I looked at Gary Johnson's position on drugs, and actually, as radical as Republicans might think he is, I think he's not radical enough.
Yeah, we didn't really explain it. You propose legalizing marijuana, and that's it. The other drugs.
Well, I think that if we legalize marijuana, we will take giant steps forward toward rational drug policy with regard to the rest of the drugs. If we legalized all drugs tomorrow, the world would be a better planet. But I have to tell you, I'm not advocating that.
What's the intellectual logic behind it? Do we own our own bodies once we're adults or not?
That you take this there on that intellectual argument, but that we take the step to legalize marijuana. We do that. We understand that then we come to recognize that the sky isn't going to fall, that things are actually better as a result of doing that. And then we move on and we actually start looking at the rest of the drugs from a harm reduction standpoint, reducing death, disease, crime, corruption. Portugal decriminalized all drugs 10 years ago, and they've shown a 50% reduction in heroin use over the last 10 years. I mean, that kind of flies in the face of logic, but that's what's happened.
So why don't you want to decriminalize all drugs?
If you're going to start off with the whole enchilada, I don't see it happening.
Oh. Well, I think that is the problem. I mean, I think there's two problems that Gary Johnson faces here, and they're coming together. He's the one who cited this Portugal study, 10 years of history, that shows that decriminalizing all drugs does great wonders for society. Unfortunately, he's running within the Republican Party, which is a majority Christian conservatives, and he knows that he simply can't win the primary if he pushes that far on this issue.
I mean, can you blame him? What do you want? Look at the heat he's already taken from Republicans for the mild stance he's taken, and here he is on that show with Sean Hannity.
The idea that America would legalize or go down this road is repugnant to me, because I don't think government should have that role in the moral destruction of a human soul, which is predictable.
Yes, I don't want our kids criminalized.
The moral destruction of the human soul. You want him to push that in the Republican primary?
Well, some people think that's what the Republicans are doing already, but cheap laugh.
Let's move on to one more subject. From your CPAC speech, speaking of realistic, you said the only party that's going to save this country is the Republican Party. You object to that.
I think he should leave the Republican Party. I think he should either run as an independent or as
Governor
a
Johnson?
libertarian.
So I would just say I've been treated really well by the Republican Party my entire career, and I am continued to be treated well by the Republican Party. I see the Republican Party as the only party that gets us out from under what is going to be a financial collapse.
Again, I applaud you, and I'm frustrated by you.
Let's move on to the war on terror.
Okay.
Governor Johnson, what's your position on Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya?
I was opposed to Iraq from the get-go. I didn't see a military threat from Iraq. I thought we had...
And now, so what should we do?
Right now, get out of Iraq tomorrow. Afghanistan. I thought Afghanistan was initially totally warranted. We were attacked. We attacked back. And after 6 months of being in Afghanistan, we'd wiped out al-Qaeda. That was 10 years ago. We're building roads, schools, bridges, highways, and hospitals in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're borrowing and printing money to the tune of 43 cents out of every dollar to do that. Let's get out of Iraq and Afghanistan tomorrow. And for all of the debate and the discussion that we would have about problems associated with doing that, I would argue that we'll have that same debate and that same discussion 25 years from now, if that's when we finally decide to get out.
Hallelujah. But I would say that a vast majority of the Republican Party is not only Christian conservative, but also pro-war. And so I think this man, if he continues to say these things, and I hope he does, will simply die in that party.
So I think that what you're saying echoes what a lot of people believe about the Republican Party. You're dead on with what it is that you're saying about the Republican Party. I'm going to give Republicans an opportunity to check off my name as their spokesperson. And what does that say to you and the rest of the world if Republicans actually nominate me? And that's where I'm...
is what I would say.
And maybe that ends up to be the case. But I'm actually putting myself out there to put that very question to the test.
Thaddeus Russell, thank you very much. Next, Governor Johnson, if he wins the Republican nomination, will have to debate President Obama. What would that be like? Well, let's find out. The president has been gracious enough to join us here in the studio tonight. He sure looks like President Obama. Sounds like him, too.
So you want to legalize drugs, huh?
So, Governor, don't answer yet. They will debate next.